Hi, thank you so much for having me here, to Val Sereno and Deborah for bringing me in for the Valery Daniels Memorial Lecture. It's very much an honor to be here tonight to speak to you all about something that I really love to talk about and that I very much believe in. And that is what I define as the systematic interface of art therapy and neuroscience. And throughout my career thus far, I've been working on more of a particular systematic integration of neuroscience into art therapy theory, practice, and research. And so to kick things off, as I often like to kind of set the stage a bit, if you're comfortable, I'd ask you to close your eyes, and I will say water. Okay. Open your eyes. And what did you see? The ocean. Who else saw the ocean? Okay. What did you see, sir?
I was
Floating underneath and swimming, right. Who saw this? Probably, maybe one or two people, right? Typically, we don't see the word water when we close our eyes. And that's because we think in images. We don't think in words. And image is our language, and it has been since the beginning of time. And so ever since we've been put on the earth, us humans speak through symbol, and we find a need to communicate what our experiences and what our lives are about. And we can call these images symbols. And these symbols are capable of representing dimensional kinds of information, from concrete to personal to universal. So a circle can be represented by a sand mandala. A circle can also represent a mouth or the earth or the sun, right? And we've been using images and symbol as healing mechanisms since the beginning of time. And we use symbol to tell stories and myth and narrative. Us humans were storytelling animals. And so here on a Greek vase, there's a story of Oedipus that gets translated through time, and with geniuses like Shakespeare, who takes this story of Oedipus and tells one about Hamlet, which is really about intrapsychic conflict and challenges within familial systems. So we translate our stories through what we might call archetype, where we get to put our own self into constellations, right? We get to put our experience, our thoughts, our perceptions, our feelings into things that have been around and get repeated over time. And with image and symbol, we're able to represent concepts that are otherwise ambiguous, such as pain and destruction. Example from here, the Ars Medica collection in the 1800s represents gout and how the pain of gout feels like a monster. Oops. The pain of gout feels like a monster and can be represented as such. And oftentimes as a clinician, we probably have a lot of art therapists here in the audience, and medical professionals and helping professionals. We often hear our patients explain themselves and their pain through metaphor. It's a natural way that we can communicate and express who it is that we are. So over time, over the years, we have found that art and science has a place together. And we began to understand an integration of art and science in a different way with the scientific revolution and the Renaissance. And in 1500s, around that time, in Florence, Italy, we began to see how the nature of visual expression changed with the advent of perspective and the image of a 3D situation on a 2D surface, which is really a trick of the eye. And so we start to learn a little bit more about the overlaps of art and science, and of course supported in the picture by many poets and archaeologists and painters and musicians and philosophers. Philosophers who speak about different kinds of knowledge and different ways of knowing. So you have Plato, who talks about that the world is a reflection of an ultimate higher eternal reality, and that is the seat of all truth and beauty. And that's a reality that we can't quite see. It's ethereal, probably rests very much in our belief systems. And then you have Aristotle, who talks about the importance of a reality that we can see, that we can measure, and that we experience with our senses. And what we can see and touch really is the most important and the way to define truth, the most important reality and the way to define truth. Then we have our buddy Pythagoras, the math guy, right? And math is the language of the scientific method, the lexicon of statistics. And it's with math that we find a universal language, like art, a universal language of humanity. So when we are able to connect and combine math and statistics and scientific methodology and ways of seeing things with image and symbol and artistic expression, we have a great capacity to understand the most complex questions and really begin to explore more thoroughly what it really means to be alive and what it means to be connected together. And as we move forward into the future, how is it that we can help one another and support one another and answer some of the problems or address some of the problems, many of which can't be addressed with linear models. This is something that led me to an interest in what we call translational sciences. And as Deborah mentioned, I'm getting my doctorate in translational sciences. And what that means is taking the scientific method or lab research, and how do we take the information, really important information, that we learn in the lab, and how do we translate that science to protocols where we're working with people? Because what might make sense in a preclinical trial, even before we get to the rats, doesn't necessarily make sense with a person. And we are remiss if we think that quantitative numerical evidence is the only thing or the best way to define the human condition. As medical professionals, we know that that's not the case. Yet, as art therapists, medical professionals, we also understand that we need evidence to prove what it is that we do is useful in a world outside of the anecdotal evidence that we've generated and gathered for almost 90 years now. So we need it all. Someone that helped us get to where we are today is our buddy Freud and his student Jung. And you know, it's always a little challenging to bring up Freud, because a lot of people, I see you, a lot of people say, I don't know about Freud. Freud does get a bad rap in our society. A lot of what Freud talked about, a lot of the ways that he explained things have not been proven. One of the reasons is, in Freud's time, we didn't have the technology to put together the experiments to show that symptom reduction actually had a statistical decrease when looking at a person's expression of their dream activity, if that made any sense. That was a lot of words. But I hope you understand what I'm saying. Freud didn't set up his work in a falsifiable hypothesis, okay? Freud developed his theory of the unconscious, the first time that anybody was able to clearly articulate a theory of the human psyche that defined that we have energies and motivations that are not conscious, that are below the surface, that are swimming below our surface. And when we don't have an effective way to express these motivations or wishes or fears, traumatic memories, then we keep them at bay. And when we do that, when we keep things out of our consciousness, we create problems within our system. And that's very important. Freudian theory or psychoanalytic theory, the theory of the unconscious, is one of the pillars of art therapy. We art therapists know that when we make art and when we express art, we are tapping into different aspects and parts of ourselves and our psyche. And we know through the process of making art that things come out of us, right? And we can see things in different ways. We can see ourselves in different ways. And we don't work with people in isolation. The therapist is another person in the room to support along that path. And this is crucial for us, the language of the unconscious. And what Jung did was he took Freudian theories and he expanded upon them. And Jung focused, he took the royal road of the unconscious, and where we first started to learn about dream symbolism in terms of human psyche. And he expanded upon that through a process called amplification. And Jung integrated archetype and artwork, mandala, all different ways of exploring the self in the system, in larger society, collective society. Many people don't know that Freud was a neurologist and also a neuroscientist. And some things that he showed us and taught us was that behavior is motivated by biological drives. He was not interested in localization, meaning he was less interested in where things happened in the brain, and he was more interested in the energy transfers that occur within the brain that infect the entire bodily system. So as I was saying before, if you have a traumatic memory or something that you are hoping to keep at bay, how much energy does what Freud would call the ego need in order to keep those impulses down? It's really describing physics. He's describing a physics understanding or calculation to the human psyche. And this is very important, this transfer of energy, because the more that we can understand how to integrate our energy, which Jung also talked about, individuation and integration, right? If we can think on a larger scale, how part of our purpose here is to become more integrated. Mind, body, head, heart, right? Self, environment. And so Freud really began to lay these concepts down. He was a person that also decided that, or found that it was most important to have therapy sessions at the same time, right? And on the same day, to recognize the importance of consistency, right? And he was also the first to write about the impact of trauma and how trauma has lifelong effects, oftentimes that are pervasive, consistent, and not consciously recognized. So what Freud did was he discussed this land of the unconscious, somewhat of a difficult thing for us to describe. I work with some really great neurologists at Indiana University, and I'll ask Dr. Grogan, hey, what do you think, how would you describe the unconscious? And neurologists are very particular. They need to be. They're very precise people, right? And so they'll say, Dr. Grogan will be like, I don't know that I can answer that. And then he'll come back, he's like, well, maybe I would say like the unconscious is like big mismatch of things that's like there. I'm like, thanks, Dr. Grogan, that's super helpful. I said, would you say that like what we know in our conscious life is say like 5%? And he's like, oh yeah, if that. So basically what we know about medicine today and our conceptualization of the brain, even from the most minute, focused neurologist, is saying something similar to what Freud said. So it's in this unconscious land that these places, these feelings, these thoughts are held. And it's with the more expansive land of the collective that Jung brought us to say, okay, we all have a personal well, but then we also have a collective well. And in this collective well, we as people have a place and a space and more of a chance to communicate with one another. So I highlight also that a burgeoning field called Neuro Psychoanalysis is really important for us to understand, because what we're looking at is how there are neural correlates to what was first identified as the theory of the unconscious. And we're looking at how the brain and the unconscious in the brain can be considered to be somewhat of a nested system, in that there's an outer, a middle, and a core in the center parts of our brain. So really difficult to get to with neuroimaging, right? But we all know this is what we get to pretty quickly when we make art, when we dance, when we make music. So that shows us, art therapists, that gives us a space at the table in terms of neuroscience, one of the spaces at the table. As much as we're informed by the science of what it is that we do, we can help the science community understand what we've been witnessing all along. How art helps us go into the reptilian and the limbic system, right? This is MacLean's model of the brain, which is not something that I would show at grand rounds in the neurology department because most neurologists don't adhere to MacLean's model, but it is a really good way for us to see, and simply, the layers of the brain. You've got the latest developing, the neo-mammalian, which is the cortical thinking part. I'm really oversimplifying things. That's okay. The paleo-mammalian, the limbic system, that's the feeling part. And then you have the reptile brain, that's your fight, flight, or freeze. I'm sure most of you in this room know this. This is how we begin. We do not need to be neurosciences to talk about the brain. We do, however, need to be careful about making assumptions about what the science can tell us about what we do. I believe the more that we talk about in an approachable way what everybody knows about the brain, and the more that we talk about that as a way to conceptualize our work, then the better off we're going to be, and the more we're going to be understood. So psychoanalysis is alive and well, right? As is the importance and value of tapping into less conscious parts of self. We are living in a society, I fear, that is becoming less and less conscious. And with integration of technology that brings us closer together at times, we also have some scary implications of what technology does in terms of our ability to connect, communicate with one another, form attachments. And so when we focus on the importance of unconscious expression and the importance of exploring the land that is not readily available, we can look at theoretical claims that are being written about today. One, that humans have innate emotional needs. Secondly, that unconscious processing is going on consistently. And third, that we learn from experience. And so, learning from experience, where does this even begin? It begins at the molecular and the biological level, where neurons come together, right? Neurons either connect together or they don't, which is interesting because if you think about it, neurons are either on or they're off. Oh, wait, I totally forgot to say. Pause on that. We're going to be ending around 8, okay? Around 8-ish. Just so you know, we got started a little late, and then we're going to have question and answers after 8. But I wanted to say that was important to say. Oh, and I also wanted to say, when I show artwork, sometimes people like to take pictures of slides to remember things, but please don't take pictures of the artwork because it's patient artwork, and even though I have consent, I don't want people to take pictures of it. So, okay, neurons are either firing or they're not, right? Binary function. Isn't that odd? At the very core of what we are, we're either on or we're off. That seems very black and white, which ended up being kind of an existential question, but that's for a different lecture. Neurons coming together, this occurs through a process, what we call neuroplasticity, and it's very much at the root of our behavior and learning. It actually is at the root of our behavior and learning. Neuroplasticity can be described as brain plasticity, right? Neurons that fire together, wire together. And neurons create different pathways, which we call networks or hubs, okay? Nothing in the brain is linear, nothing. And with very few exceptions, there are no direct pathways that go from one thing to the next, with the exception of if you touch part of the motor cortex, then you might have a specific movement in your pinky. But that's only on 1 millimeter of a nerve that happens through many different layers of systems. See how difficult it is for me to explain that? Right, because there isn't an easy way to explain the transfer of energy from one place to another in the brain. What we have been able to come closer to do is explain what neuroplasticity is. And neuroplasticity is at the root of all that we do as therapists, and that's the root of all of art therapy, in that through complex neural networks, through a mosaic of firing patterns, through growth and ongoing growth of neurons. And by the way, our neurons, we have neurogenesis. They grow throughout our entire lifetime. They grow slower as we get older, but they still grow. That's very important. A neural change includes the growth of new neurons and expansion of existing neurons and changes of connectivity between neurons. So ultimately, what this means is that we have the capacity to change. And when we explain that to people, when we explain that to our patients with science, it makes a lot of sense, okay? And it gives people a lot of motivation. So some concrete examples of neuroplasticity I happen to have with artwork. And so many moons ago, I used to work at this place called Neurodynamics, which was basically a place that provided brainwave biofeedback. And what that is that you hook people up with electrodes, and the brainwave activity goes through the electrodes so that your brainwaves were shown on a screen. And the more that people sat calmly and looked at the screen and focused, then their fast brainwaves would do one thing, their slow brainwaves would do another. And this is a type of entrainment. It's basically operant conditioning that helps to create new neural pathways so that people that I was working with, mostly who had attention deficit disorder and learning disabilities, were able to attend more quickly when they went to sit down in class. And so I conducted a little research project there where I wanted to take artwork, I wanted to take an assessment of artwork before the person started their treatment and then after they ended their treatment, to show if we could make a correlation between what the pictures showed and what their brainwaves showed. And so the task for this assessment is to draw two people doing something together in a place. So this is Veronica. And you're also asked to locate yourself in the picture. She said that she was the tether ball, which was flying off, okay? So this is before her treatment, and this was after. Here's Becky and Kelly. They were swinging on swings, before and after. Here's Jennifer, before and after. What we notice with this picture is, we don't think that Jennifer's protocol is working as well as it needs to. And sure enough, Jennifer had some other issues where she needed more neurofeedback, and we needed to change the protocol because she was becoming more impulsive, which was being reported in her behavioral reports. But it wasn't until we saw the imagery that the team really was able to see in a different way what was happening with Jennifer. Then here's Eric. Remember, two people doing something together in a place. And after. So here we have an overlap and a combination and a necessity to take a hard science perspective, those falsifiable hypotheses, empirical data. We also need to look at soft science approaches, such as psychology. And don't forget what I call the transcendent sciences, or belief systems. Because no matter what, even though we can't prove belief systems in the brain, when people come in to treatment, their belief system, or actually people in general, their belief system overrides anything that can be read in a book or with science. That tends to be the nature of humanity. And further, if you look at it as a continuum, hard science, soft science, transcendent sciences, right? People are much more adept to pick up a horoscope than Einstein's theory of relativity. There's something accessible in the things that can't totally be proven, but give us different kinds of information. This is really important. So I tried to keep 3 sets of glasses on, and in the process, I've developed what I like to say is a precise set of tenets to put up a framework for how to go about what I guess is becoming my life's work of looking at a systematic integration of neuroscience and art therapy. So the first is that the art-making process and the artwork itself are integral components of treatment that help to understand and elicit verbal and nonverbal communication within an attuned therapeutic relationship. No matter what kind of therapy you practice, it's the relationship that's the healing component. The second is that the bilateral and multidirectional processes of creativity are healing and life-enhancing. And the third are that the materials and methods utilized affect self-expression, they assist in self-regulation, and they are applied in specialized ways. So let's simplify that a little bit. Process and product occur within the context of the therapeutic relationship. So in art therapy, you have the client, you have the therapist, you have the artwork, and you have the art process. And I just outlined briefly here, this is where I spend most of my time so far in my career, laying out the theory, looking a little bit more closely. How can we study this relationship thing? Which we're not the only field that's doing this. All the psychologies are looking at this too. What is it about this relationship that's so important? And wow, boy, is the relationship hard to study, right? So I always begin, like I did with water, with looking at how we inherently use symbol to communicate. And what kind of language does the symbol hold? And does the symbol that we express and that we can access, hold a different kind of information than words do? And so if we think about what we talked about earlier with Jung, and how the symbol allows us to navigate the inside and the outside, the conscious and the unconscious, subjective, objective, what's fantasy, what's reality, feelings and thoughts. The symbol allows us to have this dialogue with ourselves and with one another. And these symbols are universal. So what Munch would describe as something very painful, but his sufferings that he wanted to hang on to as an artist, a patient might create a very similar thing, reflecting her despair, but then being able to articulate that she's not interested in having these sufferings be a part of her, right? And she's articulating that to her therapist, to the third party, to the witness. And so it's with brain science that we can understand that symbol and expression is really an isomorphic principle. And when we use terms like this, mathematical terms, to define what art making is, and this is at the root of projective testing, right? What's on the outside is a reflection of what's on the inside. It just has different properties. This is a mathematical principle. And it's also comes by way of Gestalt. We are not pieces, right? We cannot identify pieces of ourselves, right? We have to look at our entire constellation. We have to look at the entire Gestalt. And we do that through symbol and metaphor. The metaphor is a mental tunnel between two concepts or percepts that appear grossly dissimilar on the surface. That's isomorphic. And we can also be aware that historically and through time, therapies, medicine, neurologies, psychiatry have all operated in different silos, but they're all held together by biological and psychoneurobiological principles. So when we think about the value of the symbol, and we think about the relational exchange, then how can we integrate that more in our work so that we can help people understand their process? So Deborah mentioned that I still oversee a program in neuroscience in Indiana, and I moved to Indiana in 2011 to develop a Master's of Art Therapy program at Herron School of Art and Design. And in the process of developing that program, it was my responsibility to also create internship possibilities. There were only 9 art therapists in the state, and 4 places in the city of Indianapolis that were willing and able to take students. And so I did a lot of volunteerism and advocacy in my time there, and one of my favorite experiences was volunteering at the Raudebusch VA, where I worked in the OEF-OIF clinic, which is Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom, and I worked with combat veterans, all of whom had were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. Some of them traumatic brain injury, not all, but everybody had a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I worked with a really fabulous colleague, Dr. Brandy Ludke, and she was a psychologist who also specialized in mindfulness. And so we put together a few pilot studies where we ran mindfulness-based art therapy groups for the veterans. And so I use this example to highlight the power of symbol. One day, this was about 4 weeks in our first group, and this man, I'll call him John. He was 27 or 28 years old, had both a traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, returned from combat, wife was killed in a car accident, and has a 5-year-old boy. So here he is in this group. He was very nice, very quiet since I had met him. And in this group in particular, we were asking them to do two things. The first was to do a watercolor wash, which is given an 18 by 24 paper and cover it with water and then just move paint around. And so us artists in here know, like, how much control do you think that you have when you're doing that? Not very much, right? And that's the point. At this point, 4 weeks in, I wanted to see a little bit how people in the group were managing a sense of control and not, a sense of agency. And so John was sitting there working, and he's like painting, and he starts cursing under his breath, and his ears are red. Someone's in the group's like, "Are you all right there, man?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm fine." And he smiled. And they're like, "Really? Because you're cursing and your ears are really red." And he's like, "Ugh, I can't control this paint." And I was like, right. That's because it's really difficult to control watercolor, right? And I had a box of Sharpies there. And I was like, if you want, you can. And he's like, "I don't need your Sharpies, whatever." He's like, "You know what I did, though? I noticed that, like, I'm smiling when I'm saying that I'm fine, but I'm really not fine." He's like, "And that's what I do all the time." It's like, and then everybody in the group starts, "Oh, yeah, I do that too. Oh, God." And like, talking about having to put up a persona, a front, right, when you really don't feel good at all. And so the next piece of art, the next intervention in the group was to ask them to make a symbol for themselves. Same materials. Here's the Sharpies if you want. Get the Sharpies away. So John makes this. And he says, we were going around talking about it afterwards, and he said, "This is my heart. This is my heart, and I'm just going to call it the heart of darkness." And he's like, "And you know what it doesn't have are those like things attached to it." And there was a nurse in the group, and she said, "Oh, you mean like arteries?" And he's like, "Yeah, mine doesn't have that." And so the group was like, "Well, how come?" He's like, "Because I'm not connected. My heart is just floating in this darkness, and I feel completely disconnected." So that allowed the conversation to go on where the group, universality, people are talking with one another, supporting one another. The fact that this man, who rarely said much up until this time, and that's dealing with an almost unbelievable amount of trauma and pain, was able to access and articulate himself through this artwork so quickly is nothing short of phenomenal. And he felt it too. It might seem silly to people that are not in this room, like, "Oh, big deal, you controlled your watercolor." No, big deal. When life is so overwhelming and you can control your watercolor, you walk out of that group feeling good. And you've got power and you have motivation to do more. And that's crucial. And everybody in that group wanted art therapy, right? So it's with this concept of neuroplasticity. How is John able to step outside himself, represent himself through symbol? How is he able to engage in the materials in the way that he was? Through neuroplasticity. And we can understand through this malleable way that our brains work and influence our bodies and our minds and our psyches, that neuroplasticity offers us significant experiences of relatedness to one another that can inform us and influence us throughout our entire lives. Neuroplasticity allows for this reciprocity of communication, both at the verbal and the nonverbal level. Neuroplasticity is at the root of our attunement and our attachment patterns, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And most importantly, again, we're able to see that change is possible and integrate that, right? Embody that through the act of doing. And so neuroplasticity is one of the key foundations, the takeaways to know that art therapy really promotes. The other is homeostasis, okay? So when Freud talked about psychoanalytic theory and the theory of the unconscious, he was talking about homeostasis. He was trying to define for us how important it is that we maintain a balance of psyche, and that balance of psyche is directly correlated with nervous system activity, physiological systems, endocrine systems, right? Our psyches don't exist outside of our body. Emotions are physiological. Thus, we know that they're going to change. That's another hopeful thing for patients to know. When they can understand, when we can understand that our emotions are physiological and that our feeling state will definitely change, that can be very important for us in trying times. We need to understand that neuroplastic brains increase the higher up we go. So if we think about the MacLean model earlier, that top layer, the paleomammalian layer, the thinking part of the brain, is the most plastic. So those of us that are familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, thoughts, feelings, and actions, those of us that have heard the term top-down processing, start with the thoughts, right? Mindfulness is a combination of top-down and bottom-up processing, which we'll also get to in a little bit. But just knowing that the most core parts of the brain are less plastic, they're more rigid, and that's because there are animal brains. And our animal brains are conditioned for survival, period, right? And this is very important when we work with people that have trauma. Most of the clients that we work with have trauma. We all experience trauma. Trauma exists on a continuum of little t consistent traumas to big T traumas. Little t traumas are the more pervasive and the more difficult to treat. These are ongoing relational traumas compared to big T traumas such as an earthquake, right? Or even a rape. Okay? We all experience trauma on some level. And when we are not aware of what our traumas are or how they've affected us, they become part of who we are and they alter and inform our perception. This can be detrimental in terms of our identity and how we see ourselves in the world. So when we're working as therapists, it's crucial to understand how the trauma experience and traumatic memories has an impact on our bodies and our physiological systems. And I put that little, well, it's actually not little, it's big on this screen. I put that up there almost like it's way too complicated to talk about right now. But I included that. I have one similar to this later. But I include that because the system is really, really complex, okay? I'm not trying to say that the way that the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system respond to trauma and how they, how we experience the world through our senses, and when we see danger, the snake or the stick, our brains are wired to see a stick as a snake, right? You're walking down a path, especially if you're in the woods or something. You're walking down a path, and you see something on the ground that looks like a snake. What are you going to do? Ah, right? You're going to run. Good. That's the way we're made. That's what we need to do, okay? Then we'll see in a millisecond that it's a stick, okay? Then we can keep walking. What happens with trauma is that people that have endured trauma that hasn't yet been processed relate to triggers and stressors as if they were snakes, which freezes us. It's a very complicated system. It's easy to learn about, and it's really crucial for us as therapists. Here's an easier way to look at it. When we are not under threat, when our emotional threshold is low, the amygdala, which is really it's an almond-shaped structure in the deep limbic system. I'm sure we've all heard of the amygdala, right? And it's really important for our emotional processing. What happens when we perceive threat or danger is that the amygdala goes off, ding, 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 bing, bing, right? And it sends smoke signals to our frontal cortex, our thinking brain. But the problem is, when the amygdala has too much emotion, our thinking brains shut down. Our thinking brains become less plastic. We're not able to experience and understand the emotion. And this happens on a continuum, right? But it's really quite important because what ends up happening is we get stuck. And so our smoke signals are going off, but interestingly, neuroimaging has shown in fMRI studies that when the amygdala is highly activated, that not only the prefrontal cortex or the front part of the brain, but also the talking part of the brain, the Broca's and the Wernicke's area become compromised. So that means physically, neurologically, our brains have more of a difficult time talking when we're experiencing trauma, traumatic memory, right? And so we see this symptomatically in our patients. And all of the signs there point to the use of the nonverbal symbolic modalities such as art therapy as treatments of choice, okay? Great example, another guy from the group I was talking with you about, they were doing a series of free drawings in the group, and he drew this and literally said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm paraplegic in my mind." Whoa, how's that for metaphor, right? And then he draws this with markers, not very fluid, right? Stuck, he's trapped. Next picture he makes, he uses pastels, creates a sunset. We call this a difference between bottom-up and top-down processing, in that us art therapists are familiar with different uses of materials to form different intervention strategies. And probably our most sound theory of intervention that we have in the field is called the expressive therapies continuum, which looks at how different media, art materials, have different properties. And so materials such as pastels are more sensory. They feel different, and you work them in a different way, typically, than markers, which tend to be more cognitive. So we use materials that tap in to the limbic system, that tap in to those more centered part of the brains. And we might use materials that start in a more cognitive way. Well, here this man did this on his own. He used the materials to regulate himself while being quite verbal and being heard within a group, and unstuck himself by participating, right? So we talked a little bit about traumatic memory, or we talked a little bit about how traumatic memories are stored in places in our brain that we don't have conscious access to. And I kind of put this up for a little bit of laughter, because if you think about if you look up, well, where is memory in the brain? It's like everywhere, right? And so people say, okay, well, the hippocampus. Yes, that's true. The temporal lobe. Absolutely. Well, what about visual memory? Yes. What about auditory? Right? What about sense memory? That's right. What about the PAPE circuit? I don't even know what that is, but I know that it has to do with memory, right? Yeah, so memory is housed in many different areas, really super complicated. And we cannot walk around, unless we're neuroscientists that know the exact processes, we are remiss to walk around and talk about specifically where memories are held. What we can say with quite certainty is that, because this has been found with science, is that traumatic memory becomes fragmented. And traumatic memories become stored in less conscious areas or implicit, it's a good word, implicit parts of our system. And traumatic memories also get stored in our bodies. And the work of Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, Bruce Perry, Stephen Porges, polyvagal theory, all of the theorists that are experts in trauma theory all know and talk about how important this unconscious memory is and how important it is to have different and various techniques to tap into it. Because what art therapy is able to do is it helps people tap in to their memories in a safe way, and through the relationship be able to articulate and express those memories so that they make more sense. And what happens over that time is those memories can become more pieced together. And the perception of who the memory, well, who you are, but what the memory holds, and then who you are as a result of that is also able to be worked with. One of the veterans I worked with said that there seems to be a language barrier we veterans create when confronting the issue of trauma. I think through art, we basically are constructing a bridge to better understand our psychological wounds. I believe art therapy to be an excellent medium to reach intangible emotions. So art therapy helps with this reconsolidation, or the putting back together of implicit and explicit declarative memories. Art therapy assists with externalization and distancing of trauma narrative through visual form. There's that narrative again. We need to tell a story. Our narrative when we engage or have been through traumatic experiences also gets interrupted. And it's important to be able to have a context to create a new one. Art therapy assists with reducing arousal through the relaxing effects of art making, and it helps with self-regulation. And as I just mentioned, art therapy is really important when it comes to helping people process an identity that potentially has been changed because of life events. Let's know too, this is very important, that trauma is something that happens to you. That is a universal definition of trauma. Something that happens to you, okay? So when working through traumas, we need to understand how to adapt a lens so that we can understand and work through how it is that we see what's happened to us, right? So some examples of people working through identity. Again, a different group at the Raudebush VA. We found, Brandy and I, Dr. Ludke, we found that we would have these really specific setup lessons where we were integrating art therapy tasks and mindfulness techniques. And as if you're a therapist, you know that like 99% of the time nothing goes according to plan, right? You go with the will of the group. That's the beauty of psychotherapy. And we found that everybody was always talking about identity, how they looked different, how they felt different, how their lives were different before and after they returned from combat. And so we switched things up one day and had people create artwork of what they were like before and after combat. So this is a woman about 35 years old. I don't know if you can see, but the bubbles say career goals and social and happy, outgoing, pre and post. This is before, Andrew, and after. His name was Andrew. Before and after. And I mention Andrew specifically because he is one of the stars of this movie that we made, a documentary film that we're so proud of. We got funding from the Corporation of Public Broadcasting and PBS. And so it was part of a larger multimedia initiative to advocate for veterans in the use of therapeutic arts and art therapy. And so you can just Google it if you want to watch it more. So in sum, a neuroscientific approach has shown that art therapy facilitates the organization and integration of traumatic memories, reactivates positive emotions, and serves as a vehicle for exposure and externalization of difficult content, reduces heightened arousal responses, enhances emotional self-efficacy, and maintains a space for the exploration of self-perception and psychic integration, and enhances the development of identity. So, since we're talking about relationships, and this is all taking place within a relational context, we must discuss, although briefly, mirror neurons, and how mirror neurons may be connected to our ability to have empathy with one another, and they may be indicated in our study of transferences and countertransferences, which for those in the audience that aren't familiar with this terminology, transference and countertransference are the root of the psychotherapeutic practice, where transference is the patient's or the client's unconscious perception of you as therapist, and then countertransference is the therapist's unconscious perception of patient. And these relational exchanges speak to what we can call object relations, right? We all come to the table with our lives and our different experiences with different people. And so we all wear our own lenses. And so as much as we think that we're being objective with one another, we also need to consider always that we wear our own lens. And we never really are able to step outside of our subjective lens unless we have help doing so. And that's part of the great work of therapy. Part of the great work of therapy is to work through the transference. In art therapy, you have the artwork to help along with that. You have pictures and models and sculptures to help a person see aspects of themselves that they might not. So back to mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are essentially, they were discovered several decades ago in the lab over in Italy. And what was found in some is that the brain activities of monkeys was the same when the monkey was performing an action versus when the monkey was observing an action. And this happened by accident, right? But we understand, and mirror neurons took off, right, in the 90s, and they became the answer to everything. And now the scientists are saying, okay, mirror neurons used to be really popular, and now they're not really popular anymore. Because we don't have complete evidence to say that, yes, mirror neurons are responsible for elements like empathy. But what we can say is that when we have interaction patterns together, when we look at how sensory information is integrated between two people, when we look at how our capacities of expression are influenced by one another, when we think about how we're sensory beings, right? I'm going to take a little step to the side on this, but think about being an infant. Let's go back to this because it's so much more fun to look at than this, right? But anyway, so think about you're an infant, well, not that you remember in your conscious mind, but you come out of the womb and we are sensory beings. We take the entire world in through our senses, not our cognitions, right? We don't even know that we're separated from our moms, right? We don't even know that our hand is our hand till we're a year or two old. We go through the separation individuation process, right? So at our core, the way that we come into the world, we experience the world through our senses. Another reason why art therapy, music therapy, all of the creative arts therapies are so very important, because they tap in, again, to the senses, and they tap into the spaces of body and mind that we tend to put away in our daily life. So mirror neurons are responsible, or could be responsible, for many things in connection to empathy, attunement, attachment patterns, mother-to-child gaze, right? They're connected likely to language and how we form language. And when I talk about the development of a symbol and capacity for expression, how we're able to, or how we do, create symbols of others within us. We call them in some languages introjects. So we internalize other, and we carry around with us a sense of other, right? This happens by way of memory, but this also happens by way of our senses. And so mirror neurons give us a context to help us understand some of these processes. So we as art therapists can say, yes, mirror neurons are a very live thing, and the way that we act and reflect and role model and mirror and witness one another has an impact. And also, we have an extra set of tools in the game because we've got the art-making process and we've got the artwork, right? And how does that impact our mirror neurons? How does that help with our self-awareness and connectedness, our repair and attachment? So at the heart of this very much is movement. I mentioned earlier the word embodiment, and movement is at our core. Our brains are conditioned and our brains understand things. They are formed and shaped by our interactions with our environment. And so that means in order to really understand the brain, we have to understand what happens when we move. And our movement alters our perception of self and other. And this embodiment, which is really a representation of a feeling or a quality, right? It's something, it's a tangible representation. We embody our emotions, we embody our cognitions, we embody our traumas, right? There's a growing field of cognitive neuroscience called embodied cognition, where all of our cognitions, we're learning more about how our internal and our external systems influence our cognitive processes and our perceptions. This is really important for us because our actions influence our perceptions, influence our behaviors. And art making itself is a feedback loop, right? So you've got the person and the art making the creation, and then you have that within the context of the relationship. And art is a cognitive activity that requires movement in order to execute. So we need to know that information processing is incredibly complex. We're barely tipping the surface, but we're talking enough in accessible terms so that we can begin to understand more clearly and articulate this to our patients and to our comrades, our brothers and sisters in healthcare. Information processing includes internal and external processing. Think about Jung with the arrow through his head there. Art making is cognitive and is moderated by emotional and affective experiences. So think about the art making process as a sensory one with a motor output. So we take in information through our senses, and through the art, we create sensory input, motor output, and that forms a feedback loop. There we go. That forms a homeostatic feedback loop. So think about how, in these terms, the art making can help with self-regulation, not only in the process of making itself, but then also with what a person is seeing and working through. Again, knowing that change is possible, physiological change in the brain is in response to learning, behavior, and the processing of stimuli, and that's an ongoing process. This begins at the cellular, synaptic, and molecular levels. Client benefits from time, reinforcement, and reflection. And the relationship helps, again, to create new neuronal links. So the second tenet of art therapy, the processes of creativity are healing and life-enhancing. Creativity and information processing is incredibly complex. I get away with showing this slide at some of these technology, neuroscience conferences that I go to, and nobody really gives me too hard of a time. But I'm making, I think my voice just changed the thing. Talk about senses. I'm making some big generalizations here, but I can get away with it because we do know that when we look at brain imaging of a person engaged in a creative act, guess what part of the brain lights up? All of it. The whole part of the brain lights up, right? And I have a fabulous colleague. He's a cognitive neuroscientist of creativity. His name is Arne Dietrich. And he said that creativity or understanding creativity in the brain is like Sisyphus's work. And he's a computational neuroscientist. And that means, like a neurologist, a very precise way of going about understanding things. And so he says that creativity in the brain cannot be defined. Do we want to define it? This is a fabulous debate that we usually have in the larger science community. But he says that it's a compound construct in that there are so many elements that go into creativity. It makes it incredibly difficult to study. So we can know that and at the same time know that creativity does something that shifts us. It does something to connect some of these functional hubs and networks, and we know that it engages a neuroplastic process. So one facet of creativity is called flow. And this term was originally coined by Csikszentmihalyi. And basically, flow can be described as, that process, whether you're surfing or you're arting or whatever you're doing, speaking, right? That the task needs to be difficult enough so that you stay engaged in it, but not so difficult that you have to think about it too much. And there's that space in between. This might even be a liminal space, right? But we've found that this space of flow or this activity, this dynamic, however it is that we describe it, this action of flow is really healthy for us. And there's more and more evidence that shows that physiologically, engagement in flow has a healthy response to your body and your mind. Juliet Chilton has done some research in this area. And I highlight this quote because of the movement part, the motion part, and addressing different parts in the brain, the basal ganglia. That's the movement, one of the movement parts in the brain. And this is a part that's compromised when people have Parkinson's disease. When we look more closely at the parts of the brain that are compromised in different disease states, and then we also look at the literature that shows how these kinds of artistic activities can help engage those parts. And then we also look at behavior in clinical practice that makes people feel better when they're making something, right? Or after they've made something. How do we put these different elements together? How do we conduct research that can move beyond these connections and these anecdotal assessments so that we can say with more certainty, yes, this is exactly, or this is probably what art therapy is doing, and this is why it's so useful. Something else that may be connected, something else meaning a big burgeoning area like the mirror neurons were in the 90s is a network or a series of networks called the default mode network. And the more that we learn about this part of our brain, the better off I believe we are to understand processes of imagery and meditation and stillness and the value that being still and imagination has for us and the capacities that this has. Meaning, in the default mode network, when a person closes their eyes and allows themselves to daydream, kind of go into this space that's not in reality, yet that's not sleeping, often that's filled with symbols of one sort or another, these parts of the brain light up. But then when a person opens their eyes and pays attention to things, those parts are no longer activated. So we're finding that this could be really useful in our world of imagination and creativity. And what role does the default mode network play? And how is the default mode network connected to our reward systems, which we're going to talk a little bit about in a minute. So another veteran said that making art makes it easier to think. It gives us something to do while we're trying to talk about things that are hard to talk about. So I think it's a great example of what we're talking about. Flow, creativity, imaginal space, being able to be still, to step back. How much easier it is to be when we're making, and what value might that have for people. I like to introduce, just real briefly, the free energy principle, which I'm learning more about lately. And this term was coined by Carl Friston, a scientist and philosopher. And I'm just so struck. Basically, free energy is what Freud was talking about again. And Friston talks about how the brain is a predictive device. And so basically what that means is that everything that we anticipate for the future is based on what we've experienced in the past. And so when you think about it that way, now I'm really kind of dumbing it down. That's the way that I can best understand it right now. But when you think about it that way, the brain is a predictive machine, not a computer. It's a predictive machine. And the purpose of the brain is always trying to reduce what we call error or surprise, prediction error, they call it. So that happens with the snake and the stick, right? And the error comes when our minds, our thought minds, our thinking minds get disrupted with our sense minds. And so there's a chasm between top-down and bottom-up processing, and we have a surprise. And what does that mean? What does that mean for us in terms of understanding brain function? And what does that mean when we're making art, and how we have such a pleasant aha moment, right? When you create something that you enjoy, or when you're involved in the process of therapy and you learn something that you didn't quite know before, right? So how does this really heavy scientific way that has everything to do with energy, and everything to do with how energy moves from the inside and the outside, how energy is taken from our internal states, how it goes through a signal processing system where there's input, there's output, it's all manifested and manufactured through our sensing systems. And what happens to that energy with disruption of homeostasis? How do we regain it again? And how do we understand in our work when that error occurs, when there's a chasm between the thought part and the emotional part? And this happens all the time in treatment. And here I'm going to use the terms top down and bottom up in a bit of a different way. But I do this to highlight the importance of language and how important it is to know that the predictive processors are defining top-down and bottom-up processing in a similar way, but has different nuances than we do as psychotherapists. So CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, tends to work top-down, beginning with thoughts, how thoughts influence feelings and also influence actions. And so the therapist focused on cognitive aspects of his situation, education, physical aspects, interpersonal, emotional, and situational. He was also referred after 6 weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy for art therapy, where we again worked with this more bottom-up perspective, using the materials, less words, and more motion, more movement, more malleable materials to tap in, to allow him a space away from the words and allow him actually to practice moving. He originally made this, which is a mandala, a symbol of the self. And then he made this. And as you can see, for a guy that says, I feel like my body's having a nervous breakdown, there's elements here where you can see the colors are not connecting. So as time went on, I would ask him to use his non-dominant hand, which was his left side, which was the problem side in terms of his movement, to create. And we would sit there, and he would work, and he would make shapes with his non-dominant hand. And over time, we worked together for about 2 years. And over time, he did continued series of scribbles, right? We would put the scribbles together. We would talk about what that meant. Sometimes we would incorporate watercolors, which were a little threatening to him. He didn't quite like watercolors. He said I tricked him because the water would run over the tape onto the other sides, which sparked a whole different conversation about trust, right? But over time, he was able to more and more integrate. and I had left Indiana. He's still working with the team there. But I was happy to see when I left, he didn't show any overt challenges in terms of his movement. And I would ask the docs, like, why? What is it about, like, what happened? You know, over time, is it neuroplasticity? What's the deal? Is it practicing? Is it cognitive behavioral? Is it art therapy? Is it coming in to meet with the same person at the same time every week? And the doc said, I do not know. You have to figure that out. You're the therapist. I said, okay, Dr. James, that's fine. So how do we know? How do we come a little bit closer to understanding? I think a way to do this is through a very exciting, evolving field called neuroaesthetics. And neuroaesthetics essentially is understanding how the brain processes things, understanding how the brain processes things in terms of aesthetics and arts, right? And ultimately, neuroaesthetics is based in the premise that properties of the world are systematically related to properties of the mind. And neuroaesthetics originally came about in the 60s or 50s with Gustav Fechner, who was a physicist who studied what's called inner and outer psychophysics. And basically, in a nutshell, that means how the inner world, mental activity is connected with physical activity. And then in the outer world, external world, mental activity is connected with external activity. And so here evolves over time this field called neuroaesthetics, which is a tentacle of cognitive neuroscience. And like most developing and emerging fields, as things are developing and emerging, the definitions are changing. And Adjunct Chatterjee, who came to Baltimore, if anybody was at the ADA conference in Baltimore, he was our keynote speaker. And he speaks very much about an overlap. He began studying the cognitive neuroscience of beauty and looking at, well, how does the brain make distinctions between what is beautiful and what is not? And his work has evolved since then to include many different areas, but really sticking pretty certain with this overlap of aesthetics, a cognitive neuroscientific understanding of aesthetics, art, and beauty. And neuroaesthetics is very much centered on artistic viewing, right? How does the brain change when a person is looking at something? We can learn an awful lot of information about that. And the visual systems are just as complex as all the other systems in the brain. And in fact, we all probably know that our visual centers of the brain are back here in the occipital lobe. But the occipital lobe has series of hubs and networks of different associations as well. And those associations go back and forth and all over the brain. So we can imagine the implications. The more that we learn more about visual information processing, the more us art therapists can understand how that visual information processing is connected to things like rewards, motivations, feeling good, appreciation for what it is that we do, self-efficacy, self-esteem. So Zeidel, a neuropsychologist, talks about and emphasizes how the neuroimaging research shows conscious and unconscious systems interacting in a cognitive paradigm. It's very exciting for us. I wonder if by studying the brain's response to aesthetic stimuli, if we can learn more about symbolic and nonverbal communication. And as Chatterjee said almost a decade ago, and we're still not there, neuroaesthetics does not currently address therapeutic implications, and further investigation of how the physiological and psychological aspects of aesthetic experience relate to one another is an important goal for the future. So we still aren't doing that, and I believe that's a space where art therapists can come to the table. I keep mentioning reward systems. We are overrun in our society with opioid epidemic and addictions, and how these disorders of the reward systems, depression, the same, how different chemical systems, how different areas of our brain are influenced by what it is that we're looking at. How might we translate this information into protocols where we can look more closely at how the brain is changing in response to reward systems when we are making art, which we all know is a different process than looking at it. The third tenet, the materials and methods we use affect self-expression, assist in emotional regulation, and are applied in specialized ways. I mentioned earlier the expressive therapies continuum, a sound theory of intervention that we have. A real clear example of use on the expressive therapies continuum was a mistake that I made that ended up being a beautiful story that I'll take with me for my life. I used to work part-time at a rehab center, and I was working with this young man. He was 18 years old, and he had some rare illness where he became paraplegic based on the medication that he had to take for cancer treatment. So it was this wildly challenging case, and people were not completely sure what would happen to him. He wasn't sure. His voice was stilted. He was a quadriplegic. He really had no ability to move at all. And we worked together in the greenhouse up in McGee Rehab with Linda, the horticulture therapist, who's no longer with us. But we would work in the greenhouse, and he loved being around the plants, the environment, and the importance of this environment. And one day we're up there, and I was like, okay, Bobby, here's some pens and pencils. Why don't you draw something, you know, like you and your friend doing something. I don't even remember what it was, but it was him and his friend. And he was so disappointed with what he made because he looked at it, and I was like, well, what do you think about what you did? And he's like, it sucks. And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, I can't even see it. And he was using a pencil in his mouth. And I was like, well, you idiot. Me, not him. Like, why would you give a person that can, to manipulate a pencil? Then they can't even see it. I wasn't thinking clearly, right? So the next time we worked together, I gave him some watercolor paints. And I said, hey, Bobby, pick your favorite plant up there, right? So he picked his favorite plant, and he was so much happier with his product, right? Here's a simple example of this expressive therapies continuum, being thoughtful and mindful of the materials that you use. Well, he ended up loving the paint so much, he kept painting and painting, and this he made was a plant called King's Tears, which he framed and gave to me. So a sense, again, of agency, feeling better about oneself, being mindful. The work of the art therapist is not willy-nilly. We are mindful, even when we make mistakes, of what it is that we're doing. How can we understand the use of different materials and the expression, the evocation of memory? How do we understand how different materials influence our physical, cognitive, and emotional states? We've come closer to this with some studies, very few studies, using EEG. Chris Belkifer and Lucas Konopka found that in the left hemisphere brains of artists, there was more activity when they made art than in the frontal lobes of the brains. Kruk and her team used clay and took drawing materials to study different activation patterns in the brain. And they found that activation was noted in regions of memory processes, meditative states, and spatiotemporal processing, more so with the clay than with the drawing. And Garisha Kaimal, who does a lot of work in looking at physiology with art therapy, did a pretty complex study, but found when comparing drawing with doodling, that drawing and doodling in another art task, that the drawing and the doodling task ended up being the most activation and also the most pleasant for people. So here we're coming closer to tying some of the science together to what it is that people are making. The team and I did a study out in Indiana using EEG to start to tease out some of the distinctions between what is just drawing and what is rote motor movement. And this is based on the literature in neuroaesthetics that shows a change in motor activity when you look at real artwork, a real piece of art, versus a representation of that artwork. And what we found was that making versus observing artwork has shown to have distinct differences in areas of the brain. we wanted to explore these differences. So we set up a task where a person was asked to draw versus just flipping a coin. And we took an EEG measurement of that. And what we found was that there is an increase in power after the art-making task versus the rote motor movement task, which essentially showed us that something different was happening, and that there are differences in a creative task versus a pure sensory motor task. And we found that EEG is an easily accessible method of measurement for evaluating aspects of brain activity, and it can lead to further study in creative arts, neuroaesthetics, and art therapy. A problem when using EEG is electroencephalograph. It means that you're monitoring brainwave activity, is that you can't move around very much. And when you move around, there's a lot of artifact, or what's called noise, gets in the way of reading the brainwave activity. So fortunately, there's been the development over about the last 10 years or so of what's called mobile brain-body imaging. And this was developed at the Schwartz Center for Computational Neuroscience. And basically, this is a combination of EEG and virtual reality at times and different other technologies that allow a person to move in their environment. And while they're moving in their environment, we're tracking their brainwaves and finding out what's actually happening when a person is trying to maneuver with what's around them. And I think that this technology holds great promise for art therapists, dance movement therapists, music therapists, to learn more about what brain processes are being activated when we engage in creative activity. So MOBI can offer new insights into art therapy that move beyond complex patterns in EEG. MOBI can help us to isolate and identify neural mechanisms of creative activity and processes. We can understand more about the dimensions of behavior, especially when involved in the creative act in that relationship. And potentially, how might we be able to create new associations when we experience the same input, and potentially be able to identify more mechanisms of how we can overwrite or consolidate traumatic memory. Art therapists can also contribute to the experimental scientists that are using MOBI. We engage in activity that leads to people's focus and makes it a lot more fun in the lab to engage in creative activity, especially when you're working with patients. Here's a big one: how the clinical knowledge of what we do and what we observe can contribute to the scientific knowledge. Typically, people that are working in the lab have less experience with people and see less of the bigger picture than the folk that work in the field. Our therapists are well positioned to identify the behaviors, patterns of visual expression, clinical profiles, and interpersonal dynamics to that point. So, in an attempt to move the field forward through the use of MOBI, EEG, and other portable technologies, brain-computer interfaces, my colleague Garisha and I put together a paper that's a step towards a roadmap of looking at contemporary neuroimaging practices and how we might be able to use these to understand and explore and articulate the mechanisms of art therapy. As Lynn Capitan says, what are the active ingredients? How are we able to describe and define more what we know works and what we know is so meaningful? And when we work together on teams and de-silo ourselves and really embody creativity, then we realize that it's very possible. So that's all.